Can you hear us, Representative Gabbard?
I can hear you.
What?
There
Woo!
we go. We're in business.
Technology. It's possible. Thank you so
That-
much for calling in to the International
Thank you.
Cannabis Business Conference here in San Francisco. We're very excited to hear from you. Representative Gabbard, you're crisscrossing the country. You're hearing from Americans. What are they telling you about medical marijuana reform and adult use cannabis legalization? What's the sense of where America's at?
America is more united around this issue than those in Washington would have you believe. It's an amazing thing and really hope inspiring, actually, to see how, at my town halls, I'm here in New Hampshire right now. We're holding town hall meetings every single day. We've held over about 120 town halls here for the last year. And at every single one, we have Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and Libertarians coming together talking about the issues of the day and this upcoming election. And this issue around legalizing cannabis is one that has such incredible cross-partisan support, and that people in some of the most rural conservative towns here in New Hampshire also support. The frustration here in New Hampshire is that even as it is the live free or die state, it has still the most restrictive laws relating to cannabis, even medical cannabis, in a neighborhood of Massachusetts, Vermont, and other states that have done so much more to legalize and ease people's access to cannabis. We held a panel here recently, a presidential forum that we hosted, and brought in different leaders here, legislative leaders. There's a woman who's a nurse who is advocating for the legalization of cannabis with the Nurses Network. There's a woman who is on a medical board here who herself needed medical cannabis and who's the citizens advocate for this. So they brought an incredible treasure trove of real life experiences and the real challenges that folks in New England are facing, which I think are reflective of a lot of the challenges that we're facing across the country. But the hopeful thing is that this is not a right versus left issue. This is, for most Americans, it's a question of freedom and fairness and choice, and for people to be able to access this plant as medicine, to regain their lives, to achieve wellness, and in many cases, even as we're dealing with the opioid crisis, to save people's lives.
Medical marijuana is polling at 91% in America right now. I don't even think clean water polls at 91%. You've been in Congress. You've helped push legislation forward. What do you tell people when they ask, what's the disconnect here? Do you have any hopes for congressional reform in 2020 or 2021 with regard to medical marijuana?
It's really going to require the kind of grassroots-driven pressure on members of Congress to make this happen. I continue to be surprised, even as you're talking about the approval ratings, the popularity or the favorability ratings across the country. Most states have legalized some form or another of cannabis, but still in Congress, there's a lot of unwillingness to even look at the facts, to examine the data, and therefore just rely on the stigma and myths or the things that they heard growing up saying, hey, marijuana is bad. Or they say, I don't want my kids to smoke marijuana, so I can't support any kind of legalization. Others use the excuse of kind of the cart before the horse thing, saying, well, I serve on the Financial Services Committee, for example, and I co-sponsored and supported pushing through the Safe Banking Act to make sure that banks who are working with local dispensaries or others within this industry are not living under the federal shadow of potential prosecution. And some of my colleagues on the committee, I was surprised. They were just saying, well, look, even as they advocate for states' rights and respecting states' rights, they say, well, this is something that is still federally illegal, so we can't pass this bill because it's federally illegal, even though the states have done it. There's not a whole lot of logic to the arguments that are being made. So once again, I really believe in order for us to bring about the kind of change we need to pass legislation like the one I've introduced, the only bipartisan bill in Congress to end the federal cannabis prohibition, it's going to require constituents, residents, citizens of this country, calling endlessly, tweeting, emailing, dropping by, mounting this pressure that will force leaders in Congress to catch up with the rest of the country's at.
Given that 91% support and we still have trouble moving forward, is there anything that's incremental and bipartisan and realistic that we can do in this Congress or next year's Congress, given everything else that's going on in the country, or is it just going to happen at the state level?
I think what we're seeing is it's already happening at the state level. I think that the financial industry is now paying more attention to the opportunities that exist within the cannabis industry. And I think that's another pressure point that can help influence members of Congress to recognize, if nothing else, there's a strong economic argument to be made here. As far as an incremental approach, we have a number of bills in place that try to chip away at this. For example, you would think as much as our country supports veterans, that would be kind of an easy win, right? A low-hanging fruit to be able to say, our veterans are coming home dealing with chronic pain, many of them, or traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, and they don't want to just numb that pain away by taking these highly addictive opioids, and they want to be able to have access to medicinal cannabis. So let's let our VA docs prescribe that or even refer them to someone locally. Even that is not something that this Congress, this highly partisan environment in Congress has been willing to get done and to put on the president's desk. I think potentially the strongest argument that could be made where there could be an incremental approach is around medicine. It is undeniable, and there are so many examples of how medical cannabis has saved people's lives. We saw a little bit of progress made around the story of Charlotte and how her parents and those like them found the only relief for their children in their epileptic seizures through the use of cannabis. And I think there's a lot more that we can do on that to say, if nothing else, let's begin with a national decriminalization, legalization of medical cannabis.
When we talk about states leading the charge, I see Hawaii is implementing medical marijuana. There's continued drive to bring adult use cannabis to Hawaii. What do you foresee happening in your home state?
I think Hawaii, unfortunately, we've been on the cutting edge of a lot of things that I'm really proud of. But in this area, it's disheartening. I really, there's a bit of a generational difference, I think, in some ways, even though we're a strong Democratic state. The representatives and senators are pretty diverse. I was really disheartened when, even as both our state house and state senate passed legislation, I think it was last year or the year before, that said if opioid addiction qualifies under our medical cannabis access laws, it had bipartisan support. But our governor vetoed it, citing two issues. Number one, he says there's just not enough evidence and data to show that medical cannabis will help people who are struggling with opioid addiction, which is just crazy. It's crazy because we've seen how in states where people have that option to use medical cannabis, the numbers of opioid addiction and opioid-related deaths have decreased dramatically. The second reason he cited, well, if they want to include this, then they can go through the bureaucracy of the Medical Review Board and so on, who we already know is opposed to this and will have a predetermined outcome. Just shows the work that still needs to be done, even in my home state. And I am counting my voice among many to be able to push this forward, because it has to do directly with adult use, with opening up medical cannabis for all of the different needs that people have. But it also is impacting the hemp industry that I think has so much potential, especially in my home state of Hawaii, where you can farm 365 days a year. They had to completely destroy a whole crop of hemp. I think it was grown at the University of Hawaii to begin this pilot project because it had some minute fraction of too much THC in that hemp. And they had to completely destroy it. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Citizens often feel bewildered and powerless when it comes to affecting this national change, but I'm sure you've seen how citizens every day can affect their environment in their local cities, and counties, whether it was in the city of Honolulu, all the way through their regions and their state legislator's office. In 2020, what is the checklist as a citizen for engagement and pushing on these issues? It sounds like it starts with being registered to vote, registering others to vote. What do you tell people to make them feel empowered?
Absolutely. Registering to vote and making sure that your voice is heard through your vote at every level of government is essential. Try to do at least a little bit of research before you go in and cast your vote. Ask your elected leaders questions and share information. I think the biggest hurdle here is overcoming this gap in lack of understanding and demystifying the myths and stigmas that still surround cannabis, and really talk about the real life examples of how this has created a lot of opportunity or personally impacted someone's health, or really it comes down to the question of liberty and freedom, that every one of us should have the freedom to be able to choose what we put in our body. And so making sure that your voice is heard not only through the ballot box, but actively engaging with your elected leaders and others in your community is what I think will have the most powerful impact. And I think we've got to do it at every level of government.
You do you get those emails from your readers? Or your constituents? Do you get those physical printed letters? Do you get those meetings? Have they moved the needle for you? Do you have personal stories that have changed your votes?
I have, not related to cannabis. We have had other situations where there was a bill that was coming to the House floor, for example, that had to do with privacy online. It was something that, as we were heading quickly to the vote, I think the day before, it had large bipartisan support. There were things, though, in that bill that would have had unintended negative consequences on our own civil liberties and privacy. And I saw in real time how in my office, phones are ringing off the hook, emails were coming in like crazy, Twitter was blowing up with people saying, don't support this bill because X, Y, and Z. It will have a negative impact on our own civil liberties as it pertains to our online engagement. And within a span of hours on that day that the vote was being had on the House floor, it went from a bill that had overwhelming bipartisan support to having overwhelming bipartisan opposition, and the bill died. So this doesn't happen every single day, but I think it illustrates the power of the people in this country that really too often isn't recognized. People, rightly so, they feel frustrated because they feel like their voices aren't being heard in a lot of cases. But this is one of, I think, a few examples that shows, hey, when we all stand up and use every platform possible to make sure that our voices are heard, they will be heard. And depending on how your elected leader responds is how we as voters can hold them accountable. We still have the power to hire and fire people if they're not doing their job.
Lastly, Leafly, the app that I work at, our news organization, is releasing a jobs count this morning that finds that in 2020, about 240,000 Americans are employed in the cannabis industry, comprising billions and billions of dollars of economic activity. It seems like the level of institutional advocacy for cannabis might be higher than it's ever been in Washington, D.C., but there's a lot of industry leaders in the audience who've been battered by high taxes and regulations and ongoing prohibition, and some of them must be wondering if the message is getting through to Capitol Hill. So my last question is, are you seeing that lobbying blitz? Are you seeing that advocacy show up like never before on Capitol Hill? Are these K Street dollars being well spent in terms of the cannabis industry trying to participate and get its voice heard?
I think it's too early to tell, to be honest. I think that I'd have to go back and look at the results, but when we passed the Safe Banking Act as one example on the House floor, I didn't see anywhere near the kind of bipartisan support that I felt it should have. I think there's still a lot more that needs to be done. I don't know how much is being put into this from an industry perspective, but bluntly, there are still some high hurdles to cross. I think it's so important that we don't allow this issue to become caught up in the hyper-partisan environment in Washington where, yeah, sure, now in the House, Democrats have the majority where we can pass legislation like the Safe Banking Act almost with full Democrat support, with no or very few Republicans on board. But now it's going to the Senate where it's sitting there like many other bills, just waiting for a vote that may or may not come about. I think on a bright note, an area where we can look to how this has worked has been around the successful inclusion of hemp in the last farm bill that was passed, something that saw a lot of opposition, even for Mitch McConnell for a long time. But we know how powerful the hemp industry that's growing in his home state had a direct impact on him in being the one to make sure that the provision that we worked to include in the House stayed in that Senate version that was finally signed into law.
Representative Gabbard, thank you so much for standing up and leading Americans and enduring that criticism of doing so and participating in this a wonderful experiment in self-government. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Great to speak to you all. Have a wonderful conference. Aloha.